My name is Anthony Parker, and I am a member of the Jackson Juneteenth Executive Committee. And my role is simple here today. My role is to introduce our distinguished guests that we have here, and also to introduce our distinguished moderators that we have for the Jackson Juneteenth Committee here for the Social Justice and Law Enforcement panel. So first of all, thank you all for being a part of this panel. And I want to acknowledge our Jackson Juneteenth Committee. The Jackson Juneteenth Committee, we have Kelly Crum. She's with Jackson College. So I want to say thank you to Jackson College. We have Kevin Brown with Spring Arbor University. We have Leslie Bowles with Baker College. We have the mayor, Daniel Mahoney, with the City of Jackson. And we also have Anthony Parker with the ASP Enterprises company. And so I want to thank you all, and we have, I think that concludes all of our Juneteenth committee members. Nope. And we have Undersheriff Chris Simpson, sorry about that, Chris, he's with the Sheriff Department, so thank you, Chris.
No problem, sir.
Okay. All right. So what I'd like to do is to introduce our distinguished panel here. I'm going to start out, and as I call your name, would you please raise your hand so that we all can know who you are. So start out with from the community representative, Tasha Carter. She's with Residents in Action. We have returning citizens, Tony Gant. He's with Nation Outside. We have law enforcement, Elmer Hitt. He's the chief of police with the City of Jackson. We also have law enforcement of Mike Gesture. He's with Blackman Township. And from the judiciary, he's an attorney. We have George Lyons. He's a criminal defense attorney. We also have our Mayor Daniel Mahoney with the City of Jackson. Law enforcement, we have Lieutenant Kevin Rod with the State Police. And law enforcement, Sheriff Gary Schutte, Jackson County Sheriff. And law enforcement Undersheriff Chris Simpson with the Sheriff's Department. And we also have, Jamie White. Jamie is not here today. And we also have Mia Williams. She's with the Prosecuting Attorney's Office. So thank you all for participating on our panel. And I'd also like to introduce to you our moderators. We have Kevin Brown. He's with Spring Arbor University. And Kevin is the Chief Diversity Officer, and he's the Dean of Student Care at Spring Arbor University. And we also have John Willis. He is the Chief Equity Officer with the City of Jackson. So thank you all. And at this time, I will turn it over to Kevin and John for the rest of the program. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Anthony. Good morning. Our purpose for this discussion with our distinguished panel is to continue the conversation between leaders in the African American community, law enforcement, prosecutor's office, and others to find ways to address both the perception and the reality of unfair treatment of African Americans by law enforcement, and to work toward meaningful solutions that can bring peace and safety to our community. Our format this morning will begin with a series of questions posed to our panelists. After that segment has been completed, we will take questions from the audience. Please write down your questions on the slips of paper that have been provided ahead of time so we can help provide the proper follow-up if and when necessary. So, let us begin. John.
Thank you to our panelists. We have a wonderful panel for our social justice and law enforcement today. We ask that each of you answer succinctly and give time for others to respond. We will direct a question to a certain area first, say law enforcement or community, depending on the question, and there will be time for responses after that. So we'll start with a few questions on the perceptions of law enforcement toward the African American community. Some say the police killings of unarmed African American men around the country are isolated incidents given traction by the media. Others say this is a sign of broader problems in the treatment of minorities by police. Our first question is directed to Undersheriff Chris Simpson. How would you respond to that?
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Perceptions are very strong in the beholder of those who are perceiving, so they can't be discounted. I think from a law enforcement perspective, it must be considered on how operations of your patrol divisions respond to all citizens, but in particular to the question in the African American community. So you have to take into consideration on how people are viewing law enforcement. Now, the incidents that you speak of the killing of unarmed African American males, we know that it has happened. So that is a concern for all law enforcement, regardless if it happened in California, New York, Texas, or wherever. It still affects the law enforcement community. As being an African American male myself, it brings concern to me as well, as I have relatives, I have sons who are out in the community. I want to ensure that they are safe if in fact they are encountered with a law enforcement officer, deputy, state trooper, or township officers. So with that said, we have to, as law enforcement, take that into considerations on how we operate. So it's not just well, it happened in California, we don't need to worry about it. We need to ensure that our officers or law enforcement officials, from the top all the way down to the bottom, are trained properly. We need to be more engaged with the African American community to understand their perspective on how they see things.
Anyone else on the panel like to add to that? Yes, sir.
Guess the word that jumps out at me was perception. It's not perception. It's a very real thing. Every African American under sound of voice has been stopped, has had their face pushed into a hood of a car, had a gun put in their face, been called boy or you people or even the N-word by law enforcement. So it's not perception. The only difference now is that the killers of George Floyd and the young man up in Grand Rapids are being prosecuted. It used to be they got a month off with pay and a pat on the back and maybe even an attaboy. I agree with Chris Simpson, though, and this is why I'm impressed with Sheriff Schutte, that the changes are not our perceptions. The changes begin at the very bottom in the chain of command and create a culture of respect for African Americans, because let's face it, guys, police manage to stop white folks every day and not kill them. It's not harm to do. So I agree with Undersheriff Simpson that it is an internal issue of training. You don't change by perception. You change the reality of how law enforcement addresses African Americans. And I have to say that I know Elmer Hitt, I know Mike Jester, these are guys I've known for over 20 years. Certainly Chris and I have had our run-ins in court a few dozen times. These are law enforcement professionals whom I respect, and I think they're bringing Jackson County law enforcement into the appropriate place where we can address these issues.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yes. This goes beyond perception. We need to look at factual data and statistics, and those statistics support that this is a problem. The first thing to do with any problem is to acknowledge that it is a problem, and we can start with looking at the history that the very fabric of this country has been established on the basis of bias and racism. And if you look back even to the law enforcement, when was law enforcement first established? It was post-slavery when black codes were implemented. And the point of the black codes was to reestablish that free labor workforce. So we have to look at the history and we have to look at the factual data and the statistics. It isn't perception, this is reality. And until we acknowledge that fact to address it directly and head on, we won't progress.
Yes, ma'am.
As the representative from the prosecutor's office, I would have to agree with everyone here that it is not just a perception, it is a concern, and it is not just a concern, but it's also our reality. And I think Attorney Lyons made a good point that what is different in these instances is that these officers are now being prosecuted. And the role of the prosecutor is to work on behalf of its citizens and to hold everyone accountable. And I think that you will start to see things change and hopefully holding everyone accountable, including the officers. It's the role of the prosecutor to ensure that everyone's constitutional rights are upheld and to also make sure that law enforcement isn't violating those rights and that they are doing their job. So it's the role of the prosecutor to oversee that. And I think that is, in terms of prosecution, as long as we continue to be involved and hold those accountable, you'll start to hopefully see things change. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tony Gant, question we want to direct to you first. Do you think there are significant differences
in Grand Rapids where an officer wrestled a man to the ground and then shot him in the back of the head? There's not only a fear but a disregard of black life, right? Where black life is seen as less important than other people's lives. I think the data supports it. When we look at incarceration, we look at over-policing, these things happen largely and primarily in black community. Even right now in the Michigan Department of Corrections, 50% of the population is black. But the state of Michigan, we make up 13% of the population. You can't explain away these numbers by saying black community is more criminal because the data doesn't support that. Our communities are policed at alarming rates, which leads to more contact with law enforcement and inevitably leads to harm for black people.
panel response? I don't think Elmer was right in front of you, George, then after Elmer.
I've got to say one thing. I think every black man here will agree. You had that talk with your son, and moms too, I'm sorry, how to act when police stop you. Keep your hands in a certain place. Don't raise your voice. These are things that our parents had to tell us, and I had to tell my 15-year-old son that. And I saw something break in him, that he lost a part of his childhood because he realized that he would not be treated equally. And I agree with Mr. Gant. It is an issue that we have to address. That if you're black, and my God, don't be big and black, then you're a danger, you're a killer, and your phone is a weapon. I've done a number of police misconduct cases in federal court, and in every case, I get the same story. He was going for my gun. Even one guy who was literally dead at the time, he was going for my gun. So let's get back to where we started 10 minutes ago. Training, chain of command, vetting, retraining, and monitoring behaviors. I'll shut up now.
Chief Hitt.
Yeah, I'd just like to respond to the question to Mr. Gant. Did he feel officers are possibly interact differently with black citizens versus other races, or certainly different than white citizens? I think you have to acknowledge that certainly that could be a possibility. I'm not saying within our agency or the sheriff's office or state police, but no doubt different officers police a little differently and interact differently based upon experience, their own perceptions, things they may know of that are going on in the community. But with that said, it's our responsibility as leaders to discuss those prejudices that may be involved at times, but the way they are policing and train them to interact in the manner that we feel is appropriate. And I wanted to respond a little bit to the first question. There is no doubt in our community, especially in the city of Jackson, gun violence is a significant problem. And I wanted to point out that although we have not had an incident in Jackson County involving the shooting of an unarmed black man, that potential exists. That could happen while we're sitting here today. And frightening to me at times is the amount of gun violence we're dealing with, and we do know it's primarily the younger black male population that is involved. And what do we need to do as law enforcement agencies and the community to ensure we do not have the shooting of an unarmed black male, or any shooting in general? We know that is a possibility, but what steps can we take collectively to make sure that does not occur? And I certainly know, we all know, one of the biggest drivers of gun violence is poverty. And until we tackle that issue, unfortunately, we're going to continue to see some of this gun violence. We have a lot going on, I think, in this community right now, though, to address it. And I truly believe over the next few years, we're going to see a significant impact on the gun violence in our community.
Mayor Daniel Mahoney.
Good morning, everybody. So I just wanted to make sure I chimed in on this question that was asked. So in my opinion, I think that interactions with police officers highly depends on the officer themselves. And to me, I look at three factors being the most prominent things that impact the way that an officer interacts with citizens in general. The first thing, I think it comes down to their personal background. If an officer comes in already with a preconceived notion, determination, idea about a certain group of people, then that's how they're going to interact with that group of people, whether it's black people, brown people, or anything in between, right? I think the second thing that it comes down to is community. When I say community, I think it depends on who that particular officer looks at as their community, right? So if I'm not from the community or don't intimately know the people in the community that I police, they're not my neighbors. I don't have to be friendly. I don't have to be cordial because this is work. And when I go home to my neighborhood, then I can be neighbors, then I can be friendly, then I care about the people whose children that I'm around because that's my neighborhood, that's my community. I think that's the number two thing. The third thing I think is perception. And perception, I think, goes both ways. I think that it depends on how the person who they're interacting with perceives police, and I think it depends on how that police officer perceives individuals. And I know that we are kind of debating back and forth about perception, but the bottom line is perception is reality, right? If I perceive something a certain way, that is my reality, and you can't change what my reality looks like. It doesn't mean that it's 100% true 100% of the time. Not every officer is bad. Not every black person is committing crimes. So I think that, but if that's your perception, then that's reality to you. You know, so I think those are the three things that I think impact how officers interact with citizens in general.
This next question, I'm going to direct it to Sheriff Schutte. It's a two-part question. Do you believe incidents like the one in Grand Rapids are more likely to happen when young, relatively inexperienced officers are involved? And then the second part to that question is, to what extent does fear on the officer's part play a role in these situations?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. The Grand Rapids incident involved, I believe, an officer with 6 or 7 years of experience. So I'm not so sure that in that particular incident it would have mattered. But does a younger officer pose a threat to the citizens is kind of the way I interpret that question. And my first response and my gut reaction is absolutely not. In fact, most of our young officers are fresh from the academy. They're fresh from a tremendous amount of training. They have no preconceived ideas, as the mayor was talking about. Of course, they have baggage. We all have our baggage that we bring from our personal lives with us, but they've got a really clear plate of what they're looking at in front of them. So I don't think that necessarily they're a threat. I think, in fact, they're quite contrary. They're the opposite of that. I think they're going to respond in a diligent manner in the way that they were trained and the way they were taught to do so. So I don't believe that that's an issue, at least in my opinion. Fear absolutely plays a role in circumstances like that. I think, you know, I don't know enough about the Grand Rapids incident to speak intelligently about it, but I will tell you that when I saw that incident and I heard that officer making the statements about his taser, he was in fear of that. Whether or not that absolves him of any criminal liability is going to be played out in the courts, and that's where it should be played out in, right? But fear certainly plays a role in those types of things. We are trained to try and not to allow fear to dictate how we act and how we react to different things. But the fact of the matter is, we're not robots. We're human beings. And when you get put into that situation and you go from literally 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds, fear has an impact on your decision making. So certainly that, I'm sure, played a role for that officer. It's a very unfortunate incident, and I'll be curious to see how it plays itself out in court. I understand the arguments on both sides. I'm not so sure that they play a role in how I feel about it, but I do believe that our young officers, young troopers, young deputies are highly trained and well prepared to deal with the populace, and I also believe that that fear does play a role in that. Thank you.
I want to play devil's advocate for a minute. You may not be able to tell from here, but I'm a large black male.
We can tell.
For a lot of people, if you don't know me, I could be perceived to be a threat. One of the things I learned this year that was kind of frightening to me was that the law says anytime for self-defense in the state of Michigan that a person feels threatened, whether that threat is real or just perceived, they have that right to defend that. How does that work for me in a situation where I'm perceived to be something that I'm not?
Can I say something before you let him answer? And I would love for George to kind of jump in this, because it seems like a real irrational fear. And for a black man, I could never use that type of irrational fear to defend myself and against an assault charge in court. It would not work. This irrational fear that I thought this person was about to do this. I thought that would never work. And I would love to hear George give me a case where a black man was charged with an assault crime and he was able to say, well, I thought I seen him reaching for something and I killed him. And I'm worried. I don't think that should be the standard. I don't think police should have a lesser standard than a regular citizen in their ability to kill people.
I can give you two answers for that, the criminal one and the civil one. In a 42 U.S.C. 1983 constitutional act in federal court against a law officer for inappropriate behavior, the question is, would a reasonable officer in that position feel threatened? In a criminal matter, it is with a person, is the fear reasonable given those particular facts? And I have successfully argued that. Never where the officer in criminal matter was the victim, because that just doesn't happen a lot. There have been times when I think it should have happened, but that's the story for a different day. But I do want to hear Gary's response to John's question.
in terms of how you would act or respond in a particular situation, it's difficult because it's so abstract. I don't know exactly what the situation is, but
just in general, Gary, that perceived threat has to do a lot with what the mayor said and your familiarity with the culture.
Sure.
But how do you react when you are constantly the perceived threat?
I understand. Well, number one, I want to address this. So I don't perceive you as a threat, okay? I don't think, and I can't speak for everyone, but I don't think that most police officers, at least the ones that I employ, would perceive you as a threat. Now, just the size of someone is certainly cause to take notice in the event that something is going to occur, and typically they occur rapidly. What am I going to do, how I'm going to react to that, that's just tactics, right? But the perception of who you are, whether it's the color of your skin, does not play a role in fear. The only thing that would play a role in fear would be if you're balling up your fists, if you're a large man. It wouldn't matter if you're a small lady and you're balling up your fists and I'm interacting with you. There's going to be an amount of fear that comes along with that. Your heart's going to start beating. What do I do? What's my next move? Am I legal in this part? Those kinds of things always come into play. But like, for instance, dealing with someone that's as large as you are, probably no one is going to have a particular fear unless you're exuding some sort of violent tendency towards them. So I don't think that that's nearly the issue. Perhaps when everything happens, and it's say if a person your size was involved in a criminal conduct and that we were charged with investigating that and then interacting with you, it would depend on what that conduct was. If it's like a simple larceny, for instance, there's not going to be a lot of fear that's set in. There's going to be awareness of how large you are in the event that you try to do something to us. But if you're involved in an assault or some sort of other violent act, that's going to be a reality, and that's going to not probably necessarily cause the officer to be a little bit more aware of what you're doing and how your movements are interpreted. So I don't perceive you as a threat. I don't think that any of my deputies would. I won't speak with anyone else's law enforcement agency, but I do know most of them, and I don't think that they would either. But somebody who is really large is somebody that you just make note of when you're interacting. So I don't think necessarily just looking at a subject at your size is going to cause fear. But I want to say one more thing, and I realize I'm talking a lot. You'll get that from me. What I want to say is this, that I don't perceive you as a threat. I don't believe that anybody on our panel perceives you as a threat. A lot of it has to do with how you approach the officer as well. If you approach them with respect, which most folks do, the interaction is over and it's easy. If it's trying to intimidate or being violent or giving some clue as to something is going to go awry, then I think things get justified in terms of the officer taking a defensive position. So that's, in a nutshell, I suppose, the best response that I can give you, John. Hopefully I answered
I'm going to let you go with that right now. I'm going to challenge you on it later, but I'm going to let Kevin get back to his questions.
Go ahead, Tasha.
Tasha.
Sorry, I have to respond to this. So here's the reality. In Jackson, the city of Jackson and the county of Jackson, as a black mother, I don't know of any other white mother who has had a son pulled over 7 times in one summer. No ticket, no police report. And when I say not even a standard stop, I mean stop, get out of the car, frisk, look into the car type search. So it could be fear, and I do think that there is a reality of just black men. And my son is he's not as big as John. He's 6 foot and probably 165 pounds.
Pretty cool.
So It could be fear, it could be power, but there's definitely a disparity. So, like, how do we address that? If he's driving in his car, there's no defensive stature on his part. So there's something else. And so how do we address that directly? That's a problem.
Mike Jester, then Elmer Head.
Can I say one thing?
George, let me get those guys first. We know George is a criminal defense attorney, so he's got a rebuttal to these things. We're gonna get Mike Jester and Chief Elmer Head first.
I'm sorry.
I think the first step in addressing that is, as a parent, to call the law enforcement agency, tell them your concerns, and have them look into it. Every agency, I think even the state police now, has body cameras. I don't know if the state police has them.
Getting ours in August.
Yeah. And it's really easy now to investigate things like that and to see the background on why someone was stopped, what was said, why were they pulled out of the car, when they were pulled out of the car, what occurred. I think body cameras have changed law enforcement in a sense that what used to be one person's word against another, to where the officer could say, that didn't happen. And unless there was a witness, it was one person's word against another. But with the invention of cell phone cameras and body cameras, most interactions between law enforcement and the public are recorded now. So I guess I would tell anybody in the community, if you have a concern, reach out to that law enforcement agency and tell them you want it looked into. Looks like Chris.
Elmer.
First, I'll respond to what Mike just said. It cannot be overlooked that a stop could be reviewed in under the law. It's a perfectly legitimate stop, perfectly legitimate asking them to step out of the car, legitimate to search them if they give permission. But we could also look at what really is the underlying reason for the stop. So I would just say to you, as Mike said, I know everyone on this panel would be comfortable most likely calling one of the agencies and talking, but it is the broader community of getting that message to call and feel comfortable to call. And my point is, it would at least, because we don't review every single traffic stop. That's just it's not practical that we have the time to do that. But where there is concern, it at least gives us the opportunity to review those specific ones. And again, it may not be an illegal stop or an illegal search, but it could bring some concern to our attention as far as what really was the reason for the stop. So that's kind of all I want to say to that. I want to get back, though, I did really want to touch on the fear question. Certainly, I totally agree with the sheriff that fear most likely contributed to the incident in Grand Rapids, but what we don't know is what was the fear. Was the fear tied to it being a black male? Was it the fear tied that he thought he was possibly going to be seriously injured or killed? So fear comes into play, no doubt, and with fear also comes anger. And I wanted to, really my point here is these are normal human emotions. All of us in this room are fearful at times, and we get angry at times. Those are just normal emotions that we can't block from happening. But what we can do is control the impact those have on our decisions. And we actually train and talk to our officers a lot about fear and anger. And the message is, it is okay to be fearful, and it is okay to get angry at times. But you have to be able to control your fear and your anger and your response to those. And that all starts, number one, with knowing yourself and knowing how you react in those situations. And for your coworkers to know you as well and know how you react when you may become fearful or angry. And that's where the whole duty to intervene conversation comes into play too. And I just think it's important to know we have those conversations with our staff and the importance of recognizing those emotions. Because believe me, you get punched square in the face or spit square in the face, you're going to get angry. No doubt about it. Anyone in this room would become angry. But how do you respond is the important piece of that.
If I can back up to Kevin's original question there with the fear, it basically comes down to training. I mean, a seasoned officer that hasn't received appropriate training or training in some time may not respond appropriately in that situation either. So, what are we doing as leaders, to prepare our personnel? Are we getting them appropriate in-service training and making it as realistic as possible? Are we training them to understand the physiological responses, like Elmer said, that occur under these stressful events, and ensuring that they're handling them appropriately? Are we getting the de-escalation training, that we're all providing our members? Implicit bias training, to ensure that they're interacting. So a lot of it comes down to training, and for us as leaders to ensure that we're getting our folks trained properly to handle these situations appropriately.
Chris did, George.
Kevin kind of stole my thunder there, exactly where I was going with the training piece. As leaders of organizations, it is paramount and it is crucial that training endeavors are looked upon. As leaders, you must have a good vision to know the platform of the area that you're operating in. So de-escalation and things that Lieutenant Rod mentioned are, just tips of the iceberg. It is constant training, simulating real life scenarios for officers, putting them in positions where, they're going to be fatigued, they're going to be tired, but they still must operate within the confines of the procedures, policies, and guidelines that we set forth when it comes to use of force encounters. So it is critical of the leadership. And with the leadership, and it's gauged real easy, you're either effective or you're ineffective. If you have officers, deputies, or troopers out there doing things improper, then it comes down to leadership, plain and simple, because it is our responsibility to ensure that every employee is trained at a high level. If they can't grasp the training, if they're disciplined, then we get rid of them. It's just that simple. Just that simple. Going back to what was posed a minute ago as far as a person, I believe it was your son, being stopped 7 times, or if anybody is having any issues like that, there's a complaint process for every organization at this table. It's a very simple complaint process. You can call in, you can fill out a complaint form, and you can best believe if it falls on my doorstep, it's going to be looked into. And again, if a deputy is wrong, then there will be discipline. If he or she is correct, I will let the complainant know. So it is a very impartial system. And if I invite anyone to come in and review video as well and have a discussion, maybe with the deputy, maybe with your son as well, in that instance. So as leaders, we have to have those doors open to our public. And I want the public to understand that if in fact you have an issue like that, please use the complaint process, come in, review, have a conversation, and we definitely will get to the bottom of it.
May I? You guys sent me here with 5 cops and a prosecutor. Thanks a lot. But I will be brief. Somebody knows me there. But what jumps out at me, several things, and I will be brief. Number one, every cop here knows that you can find a reason to stop any car in the city. There are 1 million constitutionally protected reasons, bogus or otherwise, that will pass constitutional scrutiny. That is the unfortunate reality. So it is at the discretion of the officer that makes that stop, and it can be legal. But I want to move further on that one, because at the time of a stop, one person has a badge, one person has a gun, one person has the authority and the training to control that situation. And as I recall from my own experiences, nobody is ever particularly happy to be stopped by police. So they may curse, they may call you bad names, they may even say bad things about your mama. It doesn't matter. Your perceptions of me, a big guy like John, an old fart like myself, as being dangerous because we're 6 feet tall, because we're African American, is your problem, not mine. Don't ask the chicken to make the fox comfortable. It doesn't work that way. I agree with Chris. I agree with all these officers. It is a chain of command issue. I come from a family of cops. And I know one thing. Cops know who the bad cops are. Cops know better than the defense counsel, better than the judges, better than the prosecutors. You guys know the guys you don't want to work with. You guys know the guy who always manages to get into a scuffle. You guys should have mechanisms to review, to vet, to orientate, to retrain, and to rid yourselves of those types of persons. Don't lay it at my feet. Don't lay it at John's feet. Don't lay it at her son's feet to act right. That's what we have to tell our kids when they're young. Because you think we're dangerous, we have to be nicey nice. No, do your damn job. If you're afraid, I'm sorry, but it's a dangerous job, guys. Go get a job selling popcorn at the park. Be a postman. But a cop is an honorable job, but it is a dangerous job by definition. And we need you. So please, please, please protect our kids. Please.
Real quick, George mentioned mechanisms. There are mechanisms in place. Some of the mechanisms that we have in place, anytime a troop uses use of force, they're required to complete a use of force report. Each use of force incident is reviewed by my assistant and myself. That includes the video. That goes through my shop and goes up to our district headquarters, which is just reviewed at that point. And then goes on to our professional standards division, which is our internal affairs, and reviewed. Alerts come across. If a troop uses force 3 times, I get an alert to look into the issue. So those are some of the mechanisms that are in place, and I know other agencies have those as well.
Sorry, just wanted to make a quick comment on the conversation also. I just wanted to one, say I'm thankful for the relationships that we've been able to build over the last year since this last panel discussion, because that's what makes this such a comfortable conversation for us to all be able to be open and transparent. So that's why I'm comfortable making the statements that I'm getting ready to make. Okay, so I heard a couple key words that made my ears perk up throughout this whole conversation, and it was fear and anger. Those are 2 very, very dangerous emotions to have when you have an individual who's armed with a gun, whether they got a badge or not. I know growing up, my father always would tell me, a scared man will kill you quicker than somebody who's not scared of you. Don't go around being a bully to nobody, because that's something that's going to make them pull the trigger on you. A scared man will kill you quicker. So when you have an officer who is in fear, and then you make him angry because he feels like he's not in control of the situation, that's when I think we have situations that we have. And I think that another thing that I would say is perception again, right? Perception, it goes both ways, right? So if I'm scared and you scared and we both scared, but you're the one supposed to be in control, then that can cause my fear of you to be perceived as me, oh, you look nervous. Well, yeah, I am nervous. I mean, and I felt that way as a county commissioner being pulled over. Still in a position of power in this community, but then an officer gets behind me and I'm still in fear. And I ain't doing nothing at all but driving while black. You know, so I think that, and that is my perception. And I know I can call the sheriff, right? I know I can call the chief, but that fear still exists. It still exists. George, I'm writing that down, what you said. I love a good one-liner, man. So don't ask the chicken to make the fox comfortable. I got that one wrote down. That's going in my book to use at another later date. I will give you credit for it, though. So I think that we have to be conscious about the fact that we're all leaders sitting here, and it's easy for us to speak from a position of leadership about what we think our individuals under us will do, but I think that we have to make sure that we also look to try to engage more of the individuals who are under us in these conversations, because oftentimes what happens is we meet as leaders, we have these discussions as leaders of a department, of leaders of the troops that are out there on the streets, and then these conversations, they trickle down to the individuals who are directly under us, and they get a little bit less of impact from those conversations, and then they are responsible for trickling it down to those who are out on the road and actually engaged, and then they get a little bit less of what was given to that person. And then, it's just like when you had that old exercise of pass the story, right? By the time that story gets to the end of the line, it's a whole different story. And I think that sometimes we may think our troops wouldn't get behind someone like a John Willis and not be nervous when they pull him over. But I can tell you that just like Tasha says, it does not matter the size of an individual. Fear is fear. And if you've grown up again with that perception of, man, I watched Boys in the Hood, and that's my perception of the black community, because that's what's mostly in media and that's my only exposure, then that's what my perception is when I come from the community that has maybe 3 black people in it, or less, or whatever the outlook is to the community that I'm going to police. Then my interactions are going to be based off of what my perception is, and it may be involved in fear. And I think that we got to make sure we have those ground level officers at the table with us more for these types of conversations so that they can build those relationships.
Last comment from Assistant Prosecutor Mia Williams, and we'll go back to Kevin for our next question.
So I've been listening to both sides of the conversations, and as an assistant prosecutor, we get to oversee pretty much both sides. Again, it's our job to bring justice to the situation. And from my vantage point, and then hearing this conversation today, I don't think it's just on law enforcement. I don't think, again, it is just on the person being stopped to make law enforcement comfortable. I think it's on both sides. I think one thing that we did miss is there is bias. Officers can come with the bias that goes into the fear and the anger. If they, again, perceive someone as a certain way, they have a preconceived bias, they can react unrationally based on that bias. I think that's a real thing. I don't think that that's something that we can overlook. But however, in reviewing body cams, in reviewing these charges, and reviewing these police reports, it's not always just because how someone looks. As Attorney Lyons said, there are a number of constitutional reasons why an officer can make a stop. So when we have those interactions, we have to work on both sides, teaching our kids not only how they'll be treated when they're stopped, but I think it is right to teach our children how to act when they're stopped, to honor our lawful commands. We have rules and laws in society that we all have to abide by. We can't get by that, and we can't make exceptions for one group or another. I do, as a black person, know that we are overrepresented in convictions and in imprisonments. However, we do all have a role to play, and it's not just on law enforcement, it's not just on the citizens, but we have to come together and teach our kids how to act, as well as training, the escalation training for law enforcement, so that when we do have these encounters and we do have these stops, we don't have unfortunate results that have resulted in, for example, the Grand Rapids case and other cases around the U.S.
Okay. Tasha, I'll give you the last word, and then I got to move us on.
Okay. So I agree. We all have to be accountable, and we all have a role to play. But as a community member, I hold law enforcement at a higher standard in this regard. With any industry standard, you have you have trained experts, right? They're trained, or supposed to be trained, in this field, and so I can be disrespectful. I can be disrespectful and not break the law, and as the trained expert in law enforcement, when you stop me over or stop me, you need to remain. You need to remain. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, you don't get a pass for me being disrespectful. You don't have the right to kill me just because I'm disrespectful. So I hold law enforcement at a higher standard. I will say, for the case of my son, it was undocumented harassment and racial profiling, period. And when I did, everybody knows who the mom that I am gonna speak up. And when I spoke up, it ceased. So that in itself it tells you what the story was behind him being stopped 7 times over one summer. And one last comment. You can train all day long, but if there's no accountability to application, the training is meaningless. So I challenge law enforcement to not only train, but implement measures to ensure that that training is applied on the workforce.
Actually, we've covered a number of the things that I was going to ask.
Thanks, George.
Thank you. Attorney Lyons, I really appreciate that, really.
I'll send you a bill.
So I'm going to pivot back to John.
And what we're talking about, a couple things came to mind, and it goes along with our next question. As a African-American male, I waited. I wasn't sure what was going to happen in the Grand Rapids situation. Would there be an indictment? Would there be a charge? We see this a lot. This affects our perception of our legal system. We've seen the prosecutions. We've seen the different things happen. We've seen when Black Lives Matter prepared to march in Washington, how you had National Guards and everything there. But we also seen January 6th. We've seen police officers get beaten, sprayed with bear spray, all types of different things. And then we're watching these court cases, and they go to court and they get 60 days, or they get a year of probation. And we say, this system, we're constantly showing this picture of this lady with a blindfold over her and these scales to say everything is fair and balanced and equal, but we don't see that. We don't see that. When this happens, as law enforcement officers, as prosecutors, as mayor, as community people, how does this affect your perception, and how do we start to correct the perception and what we see? Is
that a question to anybody?
Yes, sir. That's a question to anybody.
I'm gonna kick it off. Because every time an incident happens with law enforcement, we hear the same kind of drumbeat. We're going to improve training. We're going to have more training. It seems like maybe training is not working as well as we would like, right? We can say that. We can say that training is maybe not working as well as we can like. And maybe because we never really talk about what is at the root of a lot of these problems, right? Now Chief Hick kind of talked about poverty, right? We don't talk about a lot of the root causes behind the problems that we face in community, right? Especially when we talk about law enforcement and community relations. We don't talk about the racism that obviously exists, because that's a complicated discussion. We'd rather say, hey, we're going to implement more training protocols to make sure, and we're going to have an all-pack meeting, and we go just get together and talk about it. But inevitably it happens again, right? Inevitably it happens again. And we are now at the point where we're saying, well, we need to, black people need to learn how to act better when they're pulled over, right? And that seems a little hypocritical, that black people need to learn how to act better, right? Because we've been, a lot of times with our young people, we tell them, yeah, pull up your pants, stop listening to this, and don't do this, because we're worried about how white people go perceive them. At the root, that's what the worry is. We worried how white people go perceive them. And that's a problem for me. That's a problem, right? Because you guys, again, should be the professionals. You need to be able to look past stereotypes, right? Instead of taking a stereotype and acting as if someone has committed a crime, right? Why don't you investigate, right? Why don't you, and we got data. We know that the Michigan State Police pulled over more black people than they did everybody else. We know that. It just came out, the report just came out. We know what you're doing. And then you'll say it's not racism. Well, what the hell is it? The tinted windows? The music? The data comes up every time.
And I want us to take it deeper even than what Tony just said. Think about it. If you watch the January 6th engagement, you've never seen police disrespected the way they were disrespected that day on a lot of levels. The treatment of that and the response to that, how it took place. How do we rationalize that, and how do we change that? How do we change that? We all see it. And I know you guys are not accountable for what happens in Washington, D.C., so don't think we're holding you accountable for that. We're just saying that's just a glimpse of the broader scope that we see on an everyday basis. If you see somebody force past police officers, break into a Capitol by busting windows in the capital of our country, go in and steal stuff off a desk and come out and get 90 days in jail, while a person here goes in and takes something that doesn't belong to them from Walmart and gets a year and a half. How do we rationalize that for our system and say this is justice?
Yeah, I'm going to do something I don't think I've done before. I'm going to quote Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor said he went to court looking for justice. That's what he found, just us. And that's true. Let me take a step backwards, because I think it's important that everyone understands this. We were all horrified by George Floyd, correct? But Black America was not surprised. He just happened to die in front of a camera. He was not exceptional. He was documented. The young man in Grand Rapids, again, not exceptional, documented. So Black America is not, we are equally horrified, but we are not surprised. John's question is the question. Is America a tale of two realities? Is there a justice system that places the onus of guilty until proven innocent on African Americans and just the reverse on the rest of the country? I don't have the answer. But I think we start by acknowledging that that's where we are.
So there's a couple things I want to talk about here with regards to your question and some of the things that Tony talked about as well. The disparity in justice that Attorney Lyons just brought up. Attorney George just brought up. That is a huge question, and that is the question that I'm not sure as a panel we're prepared to answer. But it is a fascinating look into what's going on in the greater part of our country with everything. And it's very valuable to have this discussion and to bring that out so that everybody hears it. Because I think a lot of people just don't say it. They see it, and maybe they glimpse over it, or they kind of think, but it needs to be said the way that you're talking. And it needs to be a conversation had by all. But I want to talk a little bit about law enforcement training, and I may have heard this wrong, but in terms of training not working, I think it is working. I think it's working really well. It's not working with lightning speed, but we're dealing with human beings here, and I don't expect that it will work with lightning speed, but it is doing well. I'm impressed. The training that we've put our deputies through, the consortium that we have with all of the townships where they all come together and we train together as one, and we talk about these issues and we work through them and we do different scenarios. I'm impressed by what we have seen in terms of how well our training's progressed. Do we got a long way to go? Absolutely, and we can never stop. We can never stop. And I had to address this, the 7 times in a summer thing. I'm glad you made a complaint because that kind of thing needs to be brought to light. We need to find out what the root cause of those issues are, ma'am, and find out why. What the problem is. When it comes to traffic stops, you're going to find this funny, or you may not even believe me, but this morning I was coming down Moscow Road and I had a state trooper behind me and my heart raced. It's not the same, I'm not equivocating it, okay? But I just want you to know that I still have that myself. I'm the sheriff. I still have that myself. So a little bit of that is probably normal for folks to feel. Incidentally, I wasn't doing anything. I was in 52 miles per hour. But I thought, gosh, I hope I don't get pulled over. Wouldn't that be embarrassing? And that's a different reality, and I respect that. And I'm not trying to equivocate, but I just want you to know that I do have those fears myself. And when it comes to the traffic stops and the disparity amongst traffic stops and why we have those numbers the way that we have, and over-policing, and what does that mean? And all these are very complex issues, but they intersect. And they intersect because, one, we have to be in neighborhoods where we've had some violent crime occur. And so we're in those neighborhoods trying to stop violent crime. This is one of the tools that we have to try and do that. It's not perfect. And I'll be the first one to tell you that. And there's some things that have gone on that are absolutely wrong, and that we must learn from those things. The only way that we can is this type of stuff right here. This is fantastic for me because I understand it a little bit better. I learn from these type of interactions how it's affecting people. And the reality of it is we want to make things better. That's the bottom line. And if we're making things worse or we're hurting people in some way, we want to know. And I got to tell you, our complaint process is completely different than the complaint process from when I started in law enforcement, which is you come down here and you fill out this form and you take care of this. We'll take it through an email, a text message, a phone call, or somebody just dropping by saying, Officer X did this and I'm mad and storming out. We look into that stuff. So that's changed dramatically. To follow up on that type of a situation is difficult because we don't know often who those kinds of folks are that just come in and yell about stuff. But we do look into those things. And Chris and I have made it a point to look into all of that type of thing. So I just want to make sure that folks understand that and just give a little bit different perspective on it. Thank you.
Mia Williams.
So to respond to your initial question, I would agree with, is it Sheriff Schutte?
Yes, ma'am.
I think that we probably aren't prepared to fully answer that question today. I think there are a lot of other things at play. One, it's on the federal level, so we can't speak to what they're doing and we can't dictate how they handle the situation. I can only speak to how prosecutions are handled on the local level. And I know it's the role of the prosecutor to handle things fair and equitably for all citizens, meaning that the law is applied fairly and equally to everyone, and that you are innocent until proven guilty. When we get those cases in, they're vetted, they're reviewed. The prosecutor on call, they will review complaints, they will review warrants, and then they will take the facts and apply the law and make sure that it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt before they are even allowed to be charged. And beyond that, once it's then assigned, it's then vetted again by the lead prosecutor and by other prosecutors to make sure that once we do charge and that we do engage in plea negotiations, that this case can go forward, that we can prove it. If it can't be proven, we don't bring it forward. If the facts don't exist to match the law that was initially charged, then we can reduce those charges. That's how we handle prosecutions on the local level. So we don't just automatically say, okay, well, the police have brought something to us, they're guilty, we're charging this, and there's nothing else is going to happen. It's vetted, it's reviewed in terms of if there is an officer-involved shooting, our lead prosecutor, Jerry Zarzinka, will take the police report, will take the facts, will vet it. A special police agency becomes involved. He writes a report, it's a very transparent process, and then that report is then released to the public. So that is how we handle prosecutions on the local level. It's not you're guilty until proven innocent. We have to make sure that we can go forward with these cases, that you can be charged, and that if we do bring it, we're bringing it so that it can be proven we have a case and it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
Mr. Mayor.
Am I allowed to disagree with that? As the defense counsel?
Yes, sir.
You can go ahead, Tasha.
I can go ahead.
No,
Okay.
no, I'm just going to say objection.
Sorry. Tasha,
Okay.
I'm sorry. I know.
Okay. So maybe I'm the devil's advocate. Maybe I'm the troublemaker. Maybe I'm just a little more raw because of what I've experienced these last 2 years, specifically during the pandemic and with all of the social injustices that occurred. But first of all, I'm glad we're having this panel, and I don't want you to take this personally, but dear white people, anytime you are talking about an issue where there's blatant disparity, between white people and black people, never say we're human, because on the flip side of that, what are we? I'm just going to sit that on the table right there. But with Tony, you're speaking my language when you say, let's look at the root cause, because when you have over-policing in an impoverished area and perceptions are all over the place, perceptions that are actually realities for black people who live in those areas, I can definitively say from the facts, from the statistics, that every aspect of the black life experience, not just law enforcement, health, education, every aspect of the black life experience, there is a disparity. So until we start to, just like I said, until we acknowledge that there's a problem, we can't brainstorm on solutions. Same thing, you have to address the root cause. And the root cause, I'm a data person. And once I start drilling those numbers and looking at factual data, it boils down to bias and racism. So until we address some of those root causes of poverty and do our self-reflection from an individual level, from an organizational level, if we're in any position of power, or just an employee of various organizations and agencies, and then look at the social impact in the community, we are not going to progress. We know from statistics, y'all, that there's disparities in the law enforcement, in education, in health. So let's quit jumping around what the true issue is and address the root cause.
I'm going to try to make my comments as brief as possible. So I know you guys, as moderators, are probably ready for us to move to another question. So a couple of comments I wanted to make. My request of our leaders in law enforcement, and I know we're going to have plenty of follow-up meetings, and I'll make this request formally again, is for the complaint process, please make it clear and please make it easy. because I don't think it is either as clear or as easy as what was stated. And oftentimes, what I've been told is they want me to speak to the officer that I have the complaint against. I've heard that 3 times in the last 2 months from people, that I had to speak to the officer who I was calling to complain about, or I have to wait to speak to somebody. So that's the first request that I would have. Make the process clear, make the process easy for filing a complaint. As far as the question that you asked, Mr. Willis, about how do you rationalize the difference that we saw visually, because we understand from a legal perspective that we can't speak to legally what they analyzed, but from a visual perspective, from what we saw, the difference between the riots and the backlash that came after George Floyd was murdered in front of the entire country versus what happened January 6th, a planned attack on our nation's capital. I mean like just a visit and tour of the nation's capital. So I'm a person that really likes to make sure that we're all on the same basis when it comes to definitions. So rationale, according to Google, because that's what I did, is just Googled it, is based on or in accordance with reason or logic. I can't find any reason or logic for the difference that I saw in the way things were treated. And not just from a legal perspective and reaction from law enforcement that was present at both of those instances and how they were treated or how they treated the people. But I also can't rationalize, give logic to, or reason in the way that the American public viewed the differences in the situation. Okay, so there is no logic or rationale behind the way I think it just really showed America's true ugly face is what it did in that moment. It showed the reality, the perception of what people felt like the difference between those two situations were. Dr. King said that a riot is the voice of the unheard. And here's the fundamental difference. I could give logic or reason to looking at January 6th and understand that, man, they was really upset about the outcome of that election. They was mad about that. I could empathize with their anger, right? I can't justify how they displayed their anger, but I could empathize with their anger. The same empathy was not shown to the thousands and thousands of people who were in protest and riot of a man being murdered. There was no empathy shown for that. There was I won't say no empathy. There was very little empathy shown for that. And I think that's the fundamental difference there. If I can see your struggle in a moment of a situation, I really felt like this ain't my fight. I'm staying out of this. If y'all want to go ahead and do that, then y'all go ahead and do that. But I can empathize. But when it's my turn to have my fight for an injustice that I went through, there's no empathy. That's wrong to me. That's wrong. Sheriff Schutte, I love you. However, my fear is so much different than your fear of being pulled over. Your fear, you actually said it. Man, if I get pulled over, this is going to be embarrassing. I may even get a ticket, right? I think that's the average person's fear of when a police officer gets behind them. The average black person's fear is, I hope I make it home from this. I hope I don't get pulled or yanked out of my car from this stop. I hope they don't bash my head in because I made a move to grab my insurance or my wallet out of my back pocket. Let me get that up and ready before they even get to the car so I can sit still as possible so they don't think I'm trying to do something I'm not supposed to be doing. Let me explain where I was coming from and where I was going to, even though I'm an adult, grown man, free in a free country in America.
So-called.
Thank you. So I think those are kind of the fundamental differences. And I think that we have to start having more empathy for each other's struggles.
We've got 15 minutes left. We would like to combine a couple questions here from the audience. And these were originally directed to the Chief Hit and to Gary Schutte. We'd ask you to take 2 minutes to give your response. And it's kind of a combination of two questions that were sent in. Young officers do not enter the police academy as blank slates. Their community, family, perhaps education have been an influence in their lives. Consider the recent mass shootings by 18-year-olds. Has or will the selection criteria change for individuals entering the academy? And what are you doing as leaders to have a more inclusive culture? Elmer, I'm going to start with you because I know the cadet program and some of the changes that are being made. So if you could talk about some of those.
Yeah, I missed the very first part of your question. I didn't understand what you said, John. Like the first
basically
sentence.
what it's saying that the cadets don't, even though they're coming as new police officers, they don't come into the academy with just empty slates. Their lives, their influences have already been made in their community, in their neighborhood. Their perceptions of what's a threat and what's not have already been shaped.
Certainly, in an ideal situation, we know if we could hire new police officers from this community, it's better. Not to say that we don't get good officers from outside the community, but it's just, I guess it's reasonable and makes sense that you hire someone from here, they're going to be a better fit for policing the community that they grew up in and they know. A couple things we have in place. We have started a police recruit position, which is essentially looking intentionally at people from this community to hire them and send them directly to the police academy in turn of becoming an officer once they complete that academy. That is different than kind of what we've done in the past. In the past, we were pretty much looking for certified police officers who had already been through an academy and hire them on and immediately start them as an officer. Not only has the hiring pool in law enforcement dwindled over the last 5 years significantly, so it's hard to find those people, but often under that concept, we were hiring people from outside of this area. With the turn at hiring and sending directly to the academy, we have seen a significant increase in people from within Jackson County, some within the city of Jackson. But you cannot hide that the racial disparity between those being hired is still an issue. Majority of the officers that we hire are white males, white females, and that is due to the applicant pool that we're drawing. So we are working on some things to try to increase the diversity. It is significantly challenging right now, but I am open to anyone's ideas, a lunchtime conversation that you might have to improve within that area. Because again, we know a police force, law enforcement agency should be made up percentage-wise consistent with the community that agency is policing.
Just 2 minutes?
2 minutes. Okay. I got a clock running for you.
Do the best I can. No, I acknowledge they're not blank slates. What I want to make sure that you understand is that I know everyone carries baggage. And when they come into a police interview with me, I got to tell you, I don't think it's an easy interview. You can ask any one of the deputies that I've hired recently. And we really put it to a couple of them yesterday, Undersheriff and I. We do that together after a panel. So it's a pretty inclusive process. And then in addition to that, we have a background investigation that we've implemented that's, well, the pages that the recruit has to fill out are 26 pages long. And then when we get our background completed, it's in a 3-ring binder, and we go through it meticulously to make sure that we're vetting that person properly. So that's some of the stuff that we've done. And then in addition to that, there's statutory requirements that cause for them to go through a psychological examination. We look very closely at that. We talk with the psychologist afterward. We don't just read what's been presented to us in a report, and we go through it. And oftentimes, Chris and I have a second interview with that person to talk about what's going on in the background and the psychological examination as well. So that's the vetting process that we put them through. Now, in terms of diversity, hopefully I got another minute. We've done a lot to try and be inclusive of the African American community. We've reached out to the Southside churches. We've gone down to the King Center. We're participants with the NAACP. We're doing all these different things to make sure that we appear and are inclusive of the African American community. We've implemented our corrections division very similarly to the way the city is using a cadet in a recruit position, and we're using that as a springboard to get folks to go out onto the road. In addition, we highly value our corrections deputies, and we're using that platform to be inclusive of diverse candidates as well. And we've received a tremendous response as a result of that. I don't have the numbers for you, but if I were to guess off the top of my head, in the last 6 to 8 months, we've probably hired at least 8 African Americans. In addition to that, we have the Explorers group that we're introducing to different schools so that we can be more inclusive of African Americans. And we've been working with Save Our Youth, and we've been working with Thomas Burke to get some of the children that he works with, I shouldn't call them children, young adults, teenagers, to come into our sheriff's office and work with us hand in hand. That's something that I believe we'll be able to implement here within the next week or two. Thank you, Chris. I'm supposed to wrap it up.
Rod, Kevin, do you want to say what anything you guys doing for diversity or changes you're making in your departments?
As far as the hiring process, our applicants go through a very thorough background. I know our recruiting and selection section travels statewide and spends a lot of time trying to recruit diverse applicants. They spend a lot of time down in Southeast Michigan, but like they've been saying, it's a challenge right now. The applicant numbers just aren't there. There isn't an interest, and that's where we really need the help from the community in trying to assist in the recruiting efforts there. Everyone here is aware of somebody that would be a good potential applicant, and kind of pushing them our way. Is going to benefit everybody and gets the involvement of the community in making these changes that we're looking for amongst the law enforcement community. So.
Thank you.
What role can schools play in this process, but also to help educate our young people and reduce the perception and fear that they may have of law enforcement?
From a law enforcement perspective, having school resource officers, school resource deputies within the school works wonders. I remember when I was the school officer for Jackson High, it was a position that I pretty much was told by my command, hey, look for this position. I had come out of narcotics, and I really wasn't looking forward to going to Jackson High School, to be honest with you. But that changed in a semester's time. The relationships that I built way back in the mid-'90s to now, if I hear somebody say Officer Simpson to me, I know it's from Jackson High. The mayor himself, he was one of my knucklehead students then, and look what he's become. I say that in jest, but those are the type of relationships that are built by law enforcement. They're able to see the law enforcement deputy or officer from a different perspective. Every day I'm in that school or was in that school and talking, doing presentations, conversations. It just helped my career. I believe it helped our organization, and I believe it helped the students at the school as well as the administrators. So having a resource officer inside of a school, not only for safety measures, now don't get me wrong, that's paramount, safety, but the relations that you build afterwards are, between Daniel and I, lifeless. They really are.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I completely concur. He beat me to the punch today to saying that. And I definitely think that it had a huge impact on the difference between I would interact if it was just a regular police officer or if it was Officer Simpson that I saw, because I knew him, not just from Jackson High, but it actually was from Parkside, then to Jackson High. And then I think that creates a totally different interaction, because that's where you can build those relationships, and understanding that not every officer that we hire can come from the community that we live in. That gives those officers that opportunity to build those true, authentic, genuine relationships, and it can change the perception of a young person as they grow into an adult and how they interact with a police officer as well.
Okay, Mike, go ahead. Give Mike last 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Real quick, you know, I was thinking back to a meeting we had recently, and Mr. Willis said that, you know, as he looks at the black community, not many parents are steering their children towards law enforcement. And I'm not sure I blame him. I mean, I don't want my children to be in law enforcement. But the ones that do decide they want to go into law enforcement can pretty much write their own ticket, because every police department in Michigan would take that diverse applicant. So then we're having to compete against larger agencies that pay more money and maybe have a more diverse area and so forth. So there's a lot of challenges to recruiting that a lot of people don't think about.
As we go, I make a referral to one of my favorite radio shows, Mr. Joe Madison, the Black Eagle on Urban View 126. People call in, he cuts them off all the time because he has one thing he wants to know. What are you going to do about it? We've got 5 minutes left. We're giving each of our panel, we're going right down the line. You've got 30 seconds to tell this crowd, what are you going to do about the things that we talked about today? 30 seconds. There's no sharing my time, claiming my time. You get 30 seconds. Line's going to go off and we move right to the next person. Starting right here with Mr. Schutte, 30 seconds is on.
So the thing that we're going to do, and I'm fortunate that we'll have 2 shots at this with the undersheriff. The things that we're going to do is we're going to implement more programming inside of our training scenarios with regard to acting on diversity, being more inclusive, and being understanding about the community that's around us. I think it's highly important. One of the things that I need to bring... Oh, are you kidding?
Next person, go. We're giving you 30 seconds.
Okay, so I'm going to make one modification to one thing that George said earlier. He said that with the George Floyd scenario, everyone was horrified. Not everyone was horrified. Some of us were horrified. For those who were horrified and want to progress, contact me, and I'm willing to work. We can work together to make progressive change. One thing, I think the power of resident leaderships. Those closest to the issue have ideas. They don't have the resources. So anyone who's willing to intentionally invest in resident leadership, that would be great.
Challenging and empowering my personnel to become more involved with community engagement. I think that's a key factor in building the relationships and the trust. And it's something that I started writing into their performance appraisals and making it a requirement.
10 seconds. Good.
I would continue. If it's wrong, I'm going to call it out. If I have a chance to be engaged in the community with the schools, I will continue to do that, to educate our young people and to educate all of us as to what our rights and our responsibilities are constitutionally. And I think Chris should just get 15 seconds.
But most of you know I am a soldier, so I will continue this fight for justice for all through transformational leadership is what I will offer. I will continue to fight for my deputies. I will continue to fight for the citizens of Jackson.
On behalf of the prosecutor's office, I would say holding not only the citizens accountable, but also law enforcement, making sure these cases are vetted. If it is law enforcement involved cases, that they are prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and making sure that the citizens are aware of the programs that we have, the expungements, the Homes Youthful and Training Act, and the 7411 in relation to drug charges to get misdemeanors and felonies off your record that are available to our young people.
I was a little nervous about calling out when that's the prosecutor's office. Yeah,
I got your back, John.
All right. I will continue to have these conversations, continue to serve in any capacity that I can to help this community, continue to ask questions when I think things are questionable. I will continue to advocate for those who feel like they don't have a voice. I will continue to build bridges to better relationships in this community between the community and the law enforcement and judicial system. And we are looking for one more individual to appoint to the Police Oversight Commission.
Time.
You got more than 30. I know
That's the mayor, Miss, my boss. What you want me to do?
I saw that.
A couple quick things. Certainly, just my vow to the community that we take these issues seriously and will continue to make improvements. Secondly, I do strongly believe that diverse workforce is important. We talked about it a little bit, but we will have a school officer back in Jackson High beginning in September or the end of August. Officer David Stallworth will be up there for us, and part of that is working now with JPS on an after-school program of some type specific to recruiting efforts.
Time.
I will continue to advocate for change, especially for people that are impacted by the justice system. I will ask law enforcement here in the city of Jackson to come up with some creative ways to limit contact with citizens. For instance, there are law enforcement agencies in the state of Michigan that have stopped pulling people over for trivial tickets. If there's a busted tail light, kind of let those people go to limit contact with law enforcement.
I will continue to ensure that my officers are trained, that they use de-escalation techniques that ultimately makes their job safer and their interactions with the public safer. We will continue to be transparent. We will look into any and all complaints. We will continue to try to work with the community. And the one thing that I took out of this is we need to hold officers accountable.
Thank you, sir. Put your hands together for our panel today. Appreciate you all coming out, going on the hot seat.
I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists. We are so grateful for you taking your time out of your very busy schedules to engage in this conversation. We hope that this will continue to inspire more community conversations around social justice initiatives, criminal justice reform, and more positive outcomes for our African American community and our community as a whole.